Picture this. You're standing on a Yorkshire moor in 872 after Christ, and the wind is howling like a living thing that wants to kill you. Not the gentle breeze that might ruffle your hair on a pleasant afternoon, but a genuine gale that can knock a grown man off his feet and send a thrown axe spinning like a drunken bird into the heather. This is the kind of weather that changes history, though nobody standing in that storm could possibly know it yet. Bjorn Windcutter, though he wasn't called that yet, just Bjorn Eriksson, son of a miner Carl from Trondheim, watches his carefully aimed throwing axe sail wide of its target like it's been grabbed by invisible hands. Behind him, 23 of his shield brothers are learning the same terrible lesson. When nature decides to intervene in human warfare, all your training and all your courage don't mean much if your weapons won't fly straight. Now, I want you to understand something about Viking warfare in the complete 9th century after Christ. These weren't mindless berserkers charging into battle screaming about Valhalla. These were professional warriors who had spent years perfecting their craft. A skilled Viking could put a throwing axe through a man's skull at 30 paces, with the same reliability that you might hit a dartboard in a pub. Their lives depended on this precision, and they practiced it obsessively. But here's the thing about the natural world. It doesn't care about your practice schedule. It doesn't care that you've spent 10 years learning to read an enemy's movements or that you can split a shield at 20 paces when the air is still. When that autumn storm rolls in off the North Sea, with winds gusting at what we might call 60 miles per hour today, your throwing axe becomes about as accurate as a paper airplane in a hurricane. Bjorn watches his younger brother Eirik line up what should have been a perfect throw. The Saxon archer is maybe 25 paces away, standing behind a wooden palisade, concentrating on his own shot. Eirik has made this throw 1,000 times. His axe leaves his hand with the proper spin, the proper trajectory. Everything perfect except for one crucial factor. The wind catches it mid-flight and curves it harmlessly past the Saxon's head. The Saxon's arrow, shot from a much more stable platform, finds Eirik's throat. Now imagine you're Bjorn, watching your baby brother, the kid you taught to throw an axe, the one who followed you into this raiding season full of dreams of glory and silver, choking on his own blood because the wind decided to play games with physics. 22 other men die that day for exactly the same reason. Not because they lacked courage, not because they were outfought by superior warriors, but because they couldn't make their weapons work in bad weather. That night, as Bjorn builds the funeral pyres, something fundamental breaks inside him. But here's what makes this story fascinating. Doesn't break him toward despair or drink like it might break most men. Instead, it breaks him toward obsession. While the other survivors are drowning their sorrows in whatever ale they can find and cursing the gods for sending foul weather, Bjorn is staring into the flames and watching how the smoke moves. Think about that for a moment. Here's a man who has just watched his brother die, who has just seen his entire military career revealed as helplessly dependent on weather conditions, and instead of giving up, he's studying wind patterns in smoke like some kind of ancient meteorologist. The other warriors think he's lost his mind. They start calling him Bjorn the Mad when he announces he's leaving the warband to seek answers in the northern wastes. But Bjorn understands something that his companions don't yet grasp. This isn't just about one bad day or one unlucky storm. The climate is shifting in the 9th century after Christ. The warm period that had made Viking expansion impossible is beginning to cool, making weather patterns increasingly unpredictable. The narrow seasonal windows that Viking raids depend on are becoming unreliable, and failed raids mean starvation for entire communities back home. When Bjorn seeks funding for his mad quest from Jarl Hakon of Lade, he's not just asking for silver to chase a dream. He's proposing a solution to an economic crisis that's threatening the entire Viking way of life. Hakon is shrewd enough to recognize opportunity disguised as madness. For the cost of outfitting one longship for a single raid that might fail due to weather, he can potentially buy exclusive access to warriors who can fight effectively in any conditions. Bjorn's wife, Astrid, pregnant with their first child, begs him to stay home and abandon this foolish quest. She sees a grieving man obsessed with an impossible goal, and she's not wrong. But she also doesn't see what Bjorn sees in those smoke patterns, mathematical relationships. Predictable. behaviors in seemingly chaotic systems, the possibility that the invisible forces that killed his brother might be understood and mastered. As Bjorn prepares to leave for the northern wastes, carrying nothing but basic supplies and a head full of theories about wind patterns, he has no idea that he's about to invent the first systematic approach to precision weapons in variable weather conditions. He doesn't know that his obsession will create an entirely new military specialty that will change Viking warfare forever. All he knows is that 23 good men died because their weapons couldn't find their marks, and he refuses to accept that as an inevitable fact of life. In a world where most people assume the gods control the weather and human beings just have to endure whatever nature sends them, Bjorn Windcutter is about to prove that careful observation and systematic practice can turn invisible forces into tools of war. But first, he has to survive 5 years alone in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth, learning secrets that no Viking warrior has ever imagined. 5 years. That's how long it takes for a grieving warrior to transform himself into something that has never existed before in human history. A man who can read the wind like other people read runes. From 873 to 878 after Christ, Bjorn Windcutter disappears into the northern wastes, and when he emerges, he brings with him knowledge that will revolutionize warfare. But let me tell you what those 5 years actually looked like, because they weren't some mystical journey of enlightenment. They were brutal, methodical, and often deadly experiments in understanding forces that most people considered beyond human comprehension. Bjorn's first stop takes him to the Sami shamans of Finnmark, and this is where the story gets really interesting. These people have been living in the Arctic for thousands of years, and they've developed ways of interacting with their environment that would seem like magic to southern Europeans. They don't just endure the wind, they've learned to read it like a language. The shamans have 17 different names for wind patterns. 17. Think about that for a moment. Most Vikings have maybe 3 or 4 words for different types of wind: strong, weak, favourable, unfavourable. But the Sami have developed a vocabulary that distinguishes between the wind that comes before a storm, the wind that comes after, the wind that spirals down from mountain peaks, the wind that flows along valley floors, even the specific type of gusting that happens when cold air meets warm water. In exchange for iron tools, which are incredibly valuable this far north, they teach Bjorn to see air currents through the movement of reindeer fur and hawk feathers. This isn't mysticism, though it might look like it to an outsider. It's applied physics. Different types of wind create different patterns, in lightweight materials, and once you know what to look for, you can predict wind behavior several seconds before it affects heavier objects like, say, a thrown axe. But here's the part that really shows you what kind of man Bjorn is becoming. He doesn't just learn their techniques and move on. He starts adapting them for warfare. The Sami use their wind reading for hunting and navigation. Bjorn begins figuring out how to use it for killing people more efficiently. The physical development of what will become known as the Windcutter axe happens on the cliff edges of the Lofoten Islands, and I want you to picture this scene because it tells you everything about Bjorn's obsession. Every single day for 3 years, this man stands on cliffs hundreds of feet above the Arctic Ocean, throwing axes at targets while howling winds try to knock him off the rocks. He's not just practicing, he's conducting systematic experiments. He discovers that shallow spiral grooves carved into oak handles create predictable spin patterns. The physics are actually quite elegant. The grooves cause the axe to rotate in a specific way that lets it ride wind currents rather than being pushed off course by them. It's the same principle that makes a rifle bullet more accurate than a musket ball, except Bjorn is figuring this out through trial and error 1,000 years before anyone understands the mathematics behind it. The weight distribution between blade and haft becomes crucial. Too much weight in the blade, and wind will grab it and send it spinning out of control. Too much in the handle, and it won't have enough momentum to penetrate armor when it hits. Bjorn tests hundreds of combinations, marking each axe with runic notations, recording wind conditions, target distance, and accuracy results. But perhaps his most important discovery is about the nature of wind itself. Most people think wind is chaotic, unpredictable, like the whims of angry gods. Bjorn realizes that wind moves in layers, like ocean currents stacked on top of each other. By watching cloud movements at different heights, a trained observer can predict ground-level wind patterns 3 heartbeats before they actually happen. 3 heartbeats, that's the difference between life and death in combat, between a successful raid and a disaster like the one that killed his brother. Training the first wind cutters requires Bjorn to invent entirely new methods of instruction, and this is where his journey becomes truly revolutionary. In hidden camps scattered across the mountains of Norway, he develops exercises that seem like complete madness to traditional warriors. Picture this. Grown men, seasoned fighters who have earned their reputations in battles across England and Ireland, standing blindfolded on cliff edges, learning to feel wind patterns through their skin. Apprentices spending months throwing axes at targets while assistants use fans made of sailcloth to create artificial gusts from different directions. Warriors memorizing complex mathematical relationships disguised as skaldic poetry because most of them can't read numbers, but they can remember verses. The dropout rate is absolutely brutal. More than 70% of the men who begin training never complete it. Some quit because the physical demands are too extreme. Others because they can't wrap their minds around the idea that natural forces follow predictable patterns. And some because they simply can't develop the sensitivity needed to feel minute changes in air pressure and wind direction. But those who do master the technique become something unprecedented in military history. A fully trained wind cutter can split an apple from 30 paces in winds that would ground any raven. They can compensate for gusts, crosswinds, even the complex air currents that form around castle walls and shield formations. In perfect conditions, they're as accurate as any archer. In bad weather, they're infinitely more effective than any other warrior alive. The economic model that emerges around this training is fascinating in its own right. Bjorn charges 3 marks of silver for basic wind compensation training, enough to buy a decent horse. But full mastery costs 20 marks plus a year of personal service, which is roughly equivalent to the annual income of a successful farmer. He develops patent-like agreements with master smiths, taking a percentage of every wind cutter axe they forge according to his specifications. By 878 after Christ, Bjorn commands a brotherhood of 200 fully trained wind readers. He has exclusive contracts with 7 major jarls across Norway and Denmark, and his personal wealth rivals that of minor kings. The mad exile who left to study smoke patterns has transformed himself into one of Scandinavia's most successful military contractors. But success brings its own problems, and Bjorn is about to discover that revolutionizing warfare makes you a lot of very dangerous enemies. The Battle of Scarborough in 880 after Christ is where theory meets reality in the bloodiest possible way, and where Bjorn Windcutter's revolutionary techniques explode into history with a violence that reshapes Viking warfare forever. Picture the scene. It's October, and a North Sea hurricane is hammering the Yorkshire coast with winds that modern meteorologists would classify as Category 2 strength. The Saxon defenders of Scarborough have retreated behind their wooden palisades, confident that no Viking force would be insane enough to attack in these conditions. They're wrong about the insanity part, but they're absolutely right that no normal Viking force could fight effectively in this weather. Bjorn arrives with 50 wind cutters, not the hundreds of warriors that typically make up a Viking raid, but 50 men who represent the culmination of his 8-year obsession with mastering invisible forces. The Saxons outnumber them 6-1, but numbers don't matter when your enemies literally cannot comprehend what they're seeing. The defenders expect the storm to be their ally. Instead, they watch in horror as Viking throwing axes curve through the hurricane winds like they're guided by supernatural intelligence, finding gaps in shield walls that should be impossible to target in these conditions. The windcutters don't fight against the wind, they dance with it, using the storm's own power to drive their weapons home with devastating accuracy. The slaughter is so complete that Saxon chroniclers struggle to find words for what they witnessed. One account describes the Vikings as demons who command the very winds to do their bidding. Another claims that their axes flew like ravens guided by Odin's own hand, turning aside for no storm. These aren't metaphorical descriptions. They're desperate attempts by medieval writers to explain precision weapons technology that won't be seen again for Europe for centuries. But here's what makes this battle truly significant. It's not just a military victory. It's a proof of concept that transforms Viking culture overnight. Word of Scarborough spreads across the Norse world faster than any longship could carry it, and suddenly every Jarl, every Herseer, every ambitious young warrior wants to understand what Bjorn has discovered. Success breeds imitation, but imitation breeds innovation. The Danish response is typically practical. They develop simplified mass training versions that focus on basic wind compensation rather than true mastery. Danish Jarls don't want to spend 20 marks per warrior and wait a year for results. They want good enough, and they want it fast. Their simplified techniques produce warriors who can hit targets in moderate winds, but they lack the almost supernatural precision of Bjorn's elite windcutters. Norwegian Jarls take a different approach, establishing exclusive academies where the children of nobles learn wind reading alongside traditional swordsmanship and horsemanship. These institutions become finishing schools for the Viking elite, producing a generation of warriors who understand both the old ways and the new science. It's social engineering disguised as military training, the nobility ensuring they maintain their advantages even as warfare evolves. In Iceland, settlers adapt windcutter principles to hunting in the volcanic windstorms that plague the island. They discover that the same techniques that make axes accurate in battle work just as well for bringing down game in impossible weather conditions. Swedish Vikings apply the mathematical principles to improve ship navigation, using wind-reading skills to sail routes that other captains consider suicidal. But the revolution runs much deeper than military applications. Wind reading becomes a new form of literacy, complete with its own vocabulary that enters skaldic poetry and everyday conversation. Young Vikings can compete to demonstrate their sensitivity to air pressure changes. Farmers use wind prediction techniques to time their harvests. The entire culture begins shifting from passive acceptance of weather to active engagement with atmospheric forces. This cultural transformation creates a theological crisis that splits Viking society. The old belief system assumes that battle outcomes depend purely on divine favor, the gods decide who lives and who dies, and human skill matters only within the limits they set. But Bjorn's techniques demonstrate that consistent practice and systematic observation can overcome supposedly divine intervention. Some Godis declare wind reading blasphemous, an attempt to usurp powers that belong to the gods alone. They argue that trying to predict and control natural forces shows dangerous pride that will bring divine retribution. Others counter that the gods gave humans minds precisely to unlock nature's secrets, and that refusing to use these gifts is the real blasphemy. Bjorn himself walks a careful line through these theological debates. He dedicates all his victories to Odin and maintains proper sacrificial rituals. But privately, he teaches his students that consistent practice matters more than prayer. He never directly challenges religious authority, but his very existence proves that human effort can achieve what was previously considered divine intervention. The political implications become explosive when traditional military leaders realize their entire power structure is under threat. Jarls, who built their reputations on conventional warfare, watch their influence evaporate as younger nobles preferentially hire windcutters for their raids. Old-school warriors find themselves unemployable, their decades of experience suddenly worthless in a world where precision beats brute force. These tensions reach their climax at the Uppsala feast of 886. The most powerful traditional military leaders across Scandinavia gather to address what they see as an existential threat to their way of life. They can't challenge Bjorn openly. His success has made him too valuable to too many Jarls. But they can remove him quietly and hope his death will slow the spread of his innovations. The assassination attempt is as elegant as it is ruthless. Poisoned mead served by a thrall who has been promised his freedom. Bjorn drinks it unknowingly during the formal toasts, and by the time he realizes what's happening, the toxin is already working through his system. But here's where the story takes an almost supernatural turn. As Bjorn lies dying, he makes one final demonstration of his wind-reading abilities. He whispers to his Lieutenant Magnus that a specific type of storm will strike the harbour in exactly 3 days, wrecking any ships that haven't been properly secured. Magnus thinks it's the poison talking there's not a cloud in the sky, and the winds are perfectly calm. 3 days later, exactly as Bjorn predicted, a sudden squall tears through Uppsala's harbour, destroying 7 ships, including 3 belonging to the men who organised his assassination. The survivors interpret this as divine retribution, but Magnus understands it for what it really is, a final demonstration that Bjorn's techniques for reading invisible forces had advanced far beyond what anyone imagined. Bjorn's death transforms him from successful entrepreneur to martyred prophet. But it also creates a succession crisis that will ultimately spread his knowledge far wider than his life ever could have. Bjorn Windcutter's death in 886 after Christ creates exactly the kind of chaos that spreads revolutionary ideas faster than any organized effort ever could. Without central control, different groups claim portions of his legacy, and in fighting over the pieces, they scatter Windcutter knowledge across the entire known world. Magnus the Bold, Bjorn's most skilled lieutenant, establishes what becomes known as the Orthodox school in the mountains above Trondheim. Magnus is a purist who insists on maintaining every aspect of Bjorn's original training methods, down to the specific cliff locations where apprentices must practice their throws. His graduates are arguably the most skilled windcutters ever produced, but the Orthodox school's rigid requirements mean they can only train a handful of new warriors each year. Meanwhile, Bjorn's son Thorstein takes a completely different approach. He recognizes that his father's techniques are too complex and expensive for widespread adoption, so he creates simplified versions designed for rapid deployment. Thorstein's innovations sacrifice some precision in favor of training efficiency. His warriors can't match the supernatural accuracy of Orthodox school graduates, but a Jarl can train 50 of them in the time it takes Magnus to produce 5. This split creates a market explosion that nobody could have predicted. Specialized axe smithing becomes a major industry from Dublin to Kiev, with master craftsmen commanding prices equal to shipbuilders. Wind reading instructors find themselves in such demand that they can charge more for a year's teaching than most Jarls earn from an entire raiding season. The economic disruption ripples through Viking society, creating new wealth and destroying old power structures. The technique reaches its absolute historical apex at Stamford Bridge in 1066, and this battle deserves special attention because it almost changed the entire course of European history. Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, arrives in England with a corps of elite windcutters trained in both Orthodox and Thorstein methodologies. These warriors represent the absolute pinnacle of the art men who can read wind patterns that defeat other warriors and compensate for atmospheric conditions that would ground arrows. Contemporary English accounts describe axes flying with such compalities, impossible precision that soldiers believe the Vikings are employing actual sorcery. The English chronicler William of Poitiers writes that their weapons turned aside for no wind, as though guided by invisible hands toward their appointed targets. This isn't medieval exaggeration, it's an accurate description of precision weapons technology that represents the culmination of 2 centuries of development. The battle begins as a catastrophe for the English. Harold's windcutters systematically destroy the English shield wall, their axes finding gaps that archers can't exploit and infantry can't reach. For several hours, it appears that England will fall to Viking conquest just weeks before William the Conqueror arrives from Normandy. If Harold had survived the battle, European history would look completely different. England would remain Viking, the Norman conquest would never happen, and the entire trajectory of medieval civilization would shift. But Harold himself falls to an English arrow, and without his leadership, the Viking army collapses despite their technological superiority. Stamford Bridge marks both the pinnacle of classical wind reading and the beginning of its decline as a military art. The age of gunpowder weapons and crossbows is approaching, and thrown axes, however accurately thrown, are about to become obsolete on European battlefields. Yet Bjorn's true legacy extends far beyond military applications, and this is where the story becomes truly remarkable. The systematic observation of natural phenomena that he pioneered influences innovations across Viking civilization. Navigators apply wind-reading principles to sailing, leading directly to the voyages that reach Vinland. Farmers use atmospheric prediction techniques to time their planting and harvesting. Architects begin designing buildings that work with wind patterns rather than against them. Most profoundly, the core idea that invisible forces can be understood and mastered through careful study plants intellectual seeds that will flower into the scientific revolution centuries later. Bjorn probably never imagined that his obsession with reading wind patterns would contribute to humanity's eventual mastery of flight, weather prediction, and atmospheric physics. But the methodical approach he developed, observation, hypothesis, experimentation, refinement, becomes a template for understanding natural forces that extends far beyond warfare. The mathematical principles underlying wind compensation prove especially influential. The geometric relationships that Bjorn discovered through trial and error contain insights into projectile motion, air resistance, and ballistics that won't be formally understood until the Renaissance. Medieval scholars studying surviving windcutter texts find mathematical concepts disguised as skaldic poetry that anticipate later developments in physics and engineering. Today, if you visit sport axe-throwing competitions, you'll see athletes unconsciously using principles that Bjorn Windcutter discovered over 1,000 years ago. They adjust their throws for wind conditions, modify their grip and stance based on atmospheric pressure, even read subtle air movements to predict gusts. None of them match the precision of warriors who spent years reading wind with their lives at stake, but the fundamental techniques remain recognizable. Archaeological evidence continues to support the reality behind the legend. Excavations of confirmed windcutter training grounds reveal practice axes with the distinctive spiral grooves that Bjorn developed. Runic inscriptions preserve fragments of the 17 wind naming systems he learned from the Sami shamans. Metallurgical analysis of surviving windcutter axes shows sophisticated understanding of weight distribution and balance that wasn't matched in European weapons for centuries. But perhaps the most lasting impact is philosophical rather than practical. In a world where most people accepted that natural forces were beyond human understanding, controlled by gods whose whims could not be predicted or influenced, Bjorn Windcutter proved that careful observation and systematic practice could turn invisible enemies into tools of human will. One grieving warrior's refusal to accept that weather was beyond human control changed not just how Vikings fought, but how they thought about the relationship between human intelligence and natural forces. His legacy lives on every time someone chooses to study rather than simply endure the world around them. The wind still blows across the Yorkshire moors where Bjorn's brother died over 1,000 years ago. But thanks to one man's obsession with understanding rather than accepting, we now know that the air itself can be read like text, predicted like tide tables, and mastered like any other tool of war. That transformation from helpless victim to master of invisible forces, that's the real revolution Bjorn Windcutter brought to the world. And in a very real sense, we're all still living in the world he created when he chose to study the smoke patterns in his brother's funeral pyre rather than simply curse the gods for sending storms.